Okay, this will be a video dealing with something that I didn't want to do for quite a while. Because I think the Venus Project is kind of boring in the same way I think some guy screaming about juju at the bottom of the lake is boring, or that I think religion is boring. Now, what a screaming man, his psychological issues could be interesting, or the psychology of religion can be interesting, or the sociology of religion can be interesting, but I find it boring because it's all fantasy. But the Venus Project doesn't even have interesting baggage, right? Because the Venus Project is a collection of old and discredited ideas, and the history of the Venus Project itself, it's like the Zeitgeist movement. It's a bunch of dipshits on YouTube. That's the intellectual history of the Venus Project. And so it doesn't even have interesting baggage. And going through the Venus Project would require covering a whole lot of subjects, and so it's kind of some work on something that's not very interesting. And so that's why I didn't want to do something like this. But people have been bugging me to do this for so long that I finally cracked it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do something on the Venus Project. Now, I've read Jacques Fresco's little essay on the Venus Project, outlining what it is, why it's better, and all that stuff. And when reading through it, I was surprised at how many of my old friends came back there. All right, you got the utopian socialism in there, you got technocracy in there, you got some Luddite paranoia in there. Now, in all fairness to the Venus projectors, they're not saying to smash the machines, but they do have that kind of paranoid, that idea that these new machines coming in, they're going to take our jobs, right? That old 200-year-old fallacy that they're repeating. And that's something that I'm going to point out throughout this critique. When dealing with some argument that the Venus Project has, I'm going to point out where this argument was made in the past. And that's going to, just to kind of burst the bubble of all these Venus projectors thinking that the Venus Project is this wholly new idea. Now, a dead giveaway that these people are kind of ignorant is that they think that they have come up with a wholly new idea of political economy. And if you read the history of political economy and you see how many things were tried, how many things were thought, you wouldn't be so casual about saying that you have a wholly new idea of political economy. What are, quote, new ideas in political economy tend to be marginal innovations plus an amalgam of a whole bunch of older ideas in a novel way. The amalgam is kind of novel. And that's all I really have to say about that. Now, before getting into any critique, we need to deal with what money is right now. And that's what this video is going to be. It's just going to be talking about money. Now, understanding what money is, that alone will probably be enough for most people to write off the Venus Project. But I'm going to keep going on after this. But in order to even do a critique, we have to establish what money is. Now, Jacques Fresco seems to think... Now, I had a hard time kind of deciphering what he thought about money. Whether he thought it was something that was imposed by the state or some central authority in a top-down authoritarian manner, and or that money is just some cultural bugaboo that has been carried forward to this day. And the one way to deal with this is, well, let's just start off very theoretically here. Let's imagine that you're growing tomatoes, and that's all you're growing. Now, in reality, farmers grow a whole bunch of other stuff. They're a little bit diversified. But let's just pretend, for this example's sake, that all you grow is tomatoes and you want pickles. Okay. How are you going to get pickles in a society without money? Well, you're going to have to find someone who has pickles and someone who wants tomatoes. So you're going to have to find a pickle-growing tomato wanter. Right? You're a tomato-growing pickle wanter. You're going to have to find a pickle-growing tomato wanter. Say that 10 times fast. Now, what if he doesn't want tomatoes? Then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to find out what he wants, and then do this little goat rope to try to get what you need. You go, okay, I have tomatoes. Here's tomatoes, turnips. You gave me turnips. Okay, you want turnips? Here's some turnips. Here's some carrots. Carrots. Oh, you want carrots? Pickles. Ah, got it. Right. So then you have to do this thing, and it's a hassle. How much easier would it be to be able to produce tomatoes to get something that you know just about everyone will accept, that the pickle grower will easily accept, and that is the problem of barter, and that is why there is a demand for some universal medium of exchange that everyone will accept. And the mediums of exchange that tended to win out were precious metals. Precious metals, not because the peasantry could use precious metals and for farming, or gold is really soft. It's not good for plowing fields or anything. It's not. There's not enough of it to do much with. So it's not that the peasantry wanted it, but merchants wanted it, smiths wanted it, and peasants typically fairs would come in. I mean, they didn't have a constant access to people who would trade whatever they had for gold and silver, but they had a regular access. That is their fair that came in once a year, and every year they take their gold and they go in and they get spices or whatever. Right, so they had a regular access to people who wanted gold and silver, and because of this, each peasant would accept gold and silver, not because they could use it themselves, but because they knew they could trade it for something else at one point of the year. And what ends up happening is, okay, now it's much easier because now you're growing tomatoes. You sell, whoever wants tomatoes, you sell them to them, and you get some silver. You use that silver, go to the guy who grows pickles, buy pickles with silver. Much easier. And this dynamic is seen, this was seen in medieval Ireland and medieval Iceland, which a lot of people argue as to whether or not it was completely stateless, but there were no states mandating a currency. But currencies came about, and money did come about in the absence of a state, and was used to deal with the problem of the double coincidence of wants. We can also see in POW camps this coming about. In World War II, in POW camps, cigarettes would become the currency. And they would become currency even for people who didn't smoke. Because if you were a non-smoker, you would still accept cigarettes in exchange for whatever you had, because you knew there were a whole bunch of other smokers in the gap, because war, like people take up smoking to calm their nerves in war. So you knew you could easily exchange your cigarettes for something that you did want. And so even as a non-smoker, you would accept cigarettes, just like even as someone, as like a peasant farmer, you would accept gold and silver because you knew there were people who would accept it for things that you wanted, like spices or whatever, to make the rotten meat that you eat all the time to taste less bad. Inflation and deflation. Now, a lot of people might be wondering why I would talk about inflation and deflation here, but toward the end of this video, you'll see why I'm talking about this. Let's take France, and let's pretend France is isolated in the world or whatever, just to illustrate the principle here. Okay, and let's say France is using silver and gold as money. And let's say overnight, the production of everything doubles. The production of crops double. The production of everything in the crafts, in the little industries, everything doubles. Everything doubles except the production of gold and silver. And so, what would happen? Well, because gold and silver are a medium of exchange, in practice, what that means is that all the gold and silver represents all of the goods and services in the economy, right, that are for sale, because you can use gold and silver to get just about anything. Okay, and so the effect is that gold and silver ends up representing all of those things. That is why it is valued. So if all of the goods and services in the economy double, but the amount of gold and silver supply remains constant, then what happens is that each individual unit of gold and silver can now buy twice as much stuff. So a lot of people are thinking, well, what if there's a money shortage? What if there's a shortage of money? Right? That's kind of a non-concept, because if the production of stuff increases so much, then what ends up happening, even in today's economy where we have these little slips of paper, All that ends up happening is that each individual dollar can buy twice as much stuff, or each individual dollar can buy as much stuff. What happens if productivity increases 100-fold? Well, then what happens is that each penny is worth as much as a dollar is worth now, and what the government may start issuing half pennies or quarter pennies and stuff like that in order to deal with the smaller denominations. That's all that would happen. And if the world was on a gold standard, then what you would end up happening is you would have infinitesimally small amounts of gold. Perhaps you would have a little sliver of gold in a junk metal coin, and that would be used to buy things. So this idea of there being a shortage of money is kind of a non-concept. And this goes back to what Jacques Fresco was talking about with the U.S. airplane production in World War II, saying that there were enough resources to produce enough airplanes to win the war, but there wasn't enough money to buy all the airplanes. Now, do you kind of see how that makes no sense? If production was, diverted to airplanes, because all the Federal Reserve notes, all they represent is resources. As all these money, they're all representative of resources. They're just placeholders. They're just mediums of exchange for resources. So if there are enough resources to produce all the airplanes that are needed to win the war, then yes, there is enough money to produce all the airplanes that are needed to win the war. Right? If the production of airplanes increases, and the production of everything else remains the same, so we're having just a massive increase in production, then all that's going to happen is that each individual dollar can now buy more stuff, right? Because there's more stuff for each individual dollar. Now, what actually happened in World War II is that the federal government had to print money because it was politically unfeasible to raise taxes. When you print a whole bunch of money, what ends up happening is that there's a whole bunch of money for the same amount of goods and services, and the result is that each individual dollar is now worth less. And that's inflation, and that hits families pretty hard, especially the poorest families the hardest. And that is in effect a tax. But it's a tax that people don't see directly. Right? It's a tax that occurs over time as a result of all the goods and services becoming more expensive. So it's less visible, and a lot of people don't make the connection of the Federal Reserve printing a whole bunch of money and the price of everything going up. However, if the federal government increases your taxes, that is something they see directly, right? And so raising the income tax is politically more difficult than just printing off a whole bunch of money. And that is why the federal government, instead of raising the income tax to like 90% or whatever to fund the war, they just printed off a whole bunch of money, because that was more politically viable. Now, the Federal Reserve. I am not a fan of the Federal Reserve, but one thing I noticed about the Venus projectors is that they tend to view the Federal Reserve as being a private bank. Now, the Federal Reserve was established by an act of Congress, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act. And the only reason that the Federal Reserve exists and is able to do what it does is because of the state requiring Federal Reserve notes for the income taxes. Because let's say that you create a bank, and you say, I'm going to print off little slips of paper. And you accept these slips of paper, and these slips of paper for goods and services, you have to accept them, and I can print off however many I want. Let's all use this currency. Who would agree to that? Nobody. But the reason people end up using Federal Reserve notes is because they need Federal Reserve notes to pay their income tax. Because the federal government only accepts Federal Reserve notes for the income tax. So even though you have no reason directly, I mean, they're just slips of paper. What are you use them for? Paper mache or something? So you don't have any real reason to have these little slips of paper, except that you have to pay your taxes with these slips of paper. And because you have to pay your taxes with these slips of paper, that creates a demand for Federal Reserve notes. Right? And only the state can create an income tax, and so only the state can prop up this Federal Reserve phony money system. So it was an act of Congress. I mean, the Treasury is who actually creates all the little slips of paper. one theory that I want to get to. Now, I absolutely hate the Federal Reserve. I detest it. I loathe it. But one myth that is repeated a lot by the Venus projectors and by libertarians is this idea that the Federal Reserve is a perpetual debt system. And the idea goes like this. The Federal Reserve loans a bank $100,000. And the bank then loans it out to a whole bunch of other people to try to get back $100,000 plus some interest so that they can pay out the Federal Reserve. But the thing is, they can't do that, right? Because only $100,000 were loaned out. There's only $100,000, full stop. There's no way that they can create $100,000 plus the additional interest when all they got was the $100,000. So the only way they can pay back the $100,000 plus the interest is to take out another loan from the Federal Reserve, and so this then creates a cycle. That's the theory. This does not happen because the banks can create money out of thin air. And this is something that a lot of people don't know, and I'm surprised that Venus projectors don't know. Well, I'm actually not that surprised looking back on their theology. But let's say a bank gets a loan from someone, and the loan can be from you. That is, when you open up a savings account, so you're basically giving a loan to the bank, or the Federal Reserve gives them a loan. Doesn't matter who gives it. They get a loan for $100,000. FDIC says they have to keep 10% in the bank, so they get $100,000 from you. Okay, but now they have $90,000, and they can loan out this $90,000. So let's say they loan out this $90,000 to someone. Okay, they are now a creditor to someone to the amount of $90,000, and they write that as an asset. So they now have $90,000 in assets. They use that $90,000 in assets to create another loan. Now they need to create. They have to keep 10% in the bank, so they keep $9,000 in reserve, and they loan out the remaining $81,000. Okay, so from a $100,000 loan they got from you, for example, they then loaned out $90,000, right, which created an asset for them. So they used that $90,000 to then create another loan for $81,000. So from the $100,000 they were able to loan out $171,000, and they can do this 5 or 6 times. I forget. There's a limit on how many times they can do this, but they can do this a few times, and in this way they're creating money. And so that is how they are able to pay back the Federal Reserve, because they can create more money in order to pay back the $100,000 plus interest either to you or to the Federal Reserve. Okay, that's it for part 1. I think this may end up only being a 2-part series because the money issue is really the most complex thing. The calculation problem with socialism and how to centrally plan an economy without price information, that's all pretty simple, and I can get through that a lot faster. So this may end up only being a 2-part series. The Venus Project, I guess, is just not sophisticated enough to require much more than that. So stay tuned for, I guess, only one more part of this. Probably. Maybe it'll be three parts. We'll see.